when we come together to reflect upon the devastating consequences of violence, we are confronted not only with the harrowing details of individual tragedies, but also with the larger questions of justice, responsibility, and the fragility of the social bonds that hold families and communities together. There are few narratives more difficult to comprehend than those in which acts of violence erupt within the intimate space of family, where trust and loyalty should prevail, and yet where resentment, entitlement, and despair can take root. Today, I will address a case that serves as a somber reminder of how quickly fractures in family relationships can escalate to catastrophic ends, and in doing so, I will examine the themes of crime, investigation, motive, law enforcement response, and the enduring lessons society must take from such events. The story begins in what might appear to be an ordinary suburban neighborhood. On the surface, there is little to distinguish it from countless others: modest homes, familiar routines, and lives bound together by proximity and community. Yet, beneath the surface, unresolved tensions were festering, and they would culminate in an act of violence that shocked not only those who knew the family, but also the broader public. The triggering moment was deceptively ordinary: a spouse returning from a trip, unable to access her home, uncertain why her husband had not answered her calls, and alarmed by the stillness of the place where there should have been signs of daily life. From these first uneasy suspicions grew the realization that something was deeply amiss, and before long, the truth of what had occurred would alter lives irreversibly. Law enforcement was summoned, initially to what was thought to be a welfare check. Such calls are routine in every jurisdiction, yet officers are trained to recognize that beneath the veil of routine there may lie danger. This situation was no exception. Observations of broken glass, the appearance of bullet holes, and an ominous silence inside the home transformed what might have been a simple matter of reassurance into a grim investigation. Within minutes, officers forced entry, not only in the hope of aiding someone who might be in distress, but also with the growing awareness that a crime of violence might already have taken place. What they encountered confirmed their worst fears. The homeowner had been fatally shot. The scene bore unmistakable signs of a targeted attack, and the entire environment now had to be preserved as evidence of homicide. From this moment, the case was no longer about uncertainty, but about pursuit of truth. Officers began a systematic search of the premises. They encountered disarray, objects out of place, and above all, the telltale markings of ballistic evidence. Shell casings lay on the floor, testifying not only to the brutality of the act, but also to the type of weapon used and the determination of the assailant. The absence of the firearm itself was notable, suggesting deliberate concealment or removal by the perpetrators. Standard investigative procedure demanded a careful sweep of the property, including the basement, closets, and other confined spaces, not only to ensure officer safety, but also to account for the possibility of an intruder still being present. In this case, while no assailant was found within the home, the psychological imprint of violence was everywhere. Once law enforcement secured the scene, the duty fell upon them to convey the devastating truth to the surviving spouse. It is never an easy task for officers to inform someone that a loved one has died, and the raw grief, disbelief, and anguish that followed illustrated the human toll of homicide. Yet, amid this grief, the investigation had to proceed, because every moment mattered. Witnesses in the neighborhood were canvassed, potential leads gathered, and accounts of unusual noises or disturbances documented. Neighbors recalled hearing sounds in the early hours of the morning, some likened to gunfire, though none had been able to connect those sounds with certainty to the home in question. These fragments of testimony, though inconclusive on their own, would contribute to the broader tapestry of understanding. As is often the case in homicide investigations, attention soon turned inward to the family itself. Investigators sought to establish motive, and in doing so, they confronted a troubling history. The victim's adult children from a previous relationship had long expressed hostility toward him and toward his new partner, There were recollections of threats, some chilling in their specificity, including violent imagery that revealed both resentment and rage. These sons, though educated and fully capable of independence, had adopted an attitude of entitlement, insisting that their father owed them material support indefinitely. They resisted the notion of self-sufficiency and instead demanded continued financial provision, extending from housing to cars to insurance. Their sense of grievance was intensified by the belief that their father's choices had deprived them of stability, and over time, their resentment hardened into menace. For investigators, this history was impossible to ignore. Threats of violence, coupled with long-standing disputes about money and inheritance, created a profile of risk that aligned with the tragedy that had unfolded. When suspicion pointed toward the sons, the next logical step was to locate and question them. Yet locating them was not as straightforward as summoning willing witnesses. When law enforcement converged on their residence, prepared with a search warrant and backed by tactical support, they were met not with cooperation, but with armed resistance. What followed was an extraordinary confrontation in which the sons fired upon officers, refusing every opportunity to surrender. It was an act of defiance that escalated the tragedy into a direct threat to public safety and underscored the depth of their alienation and desperation. The tactical response that ensued was by necessity, cautious, deliberate, and prolonged. Officers withdrew to safer positions, established a perimeter, and worked to protect nearby residents from potential harm. The surrounding neighborhood was instructed to shelter, illustrating once again how private conflict can spill outward to imperil entire communities. Hours passed as officers attempted to establish control, breach the property, and ultimately deploy surveillance tools to assess the situation. What they discovered confirmed the grim trajectory. The sons, rather than surrender, had died within the house, apparently choosing self-destruction over accountability. The forensic evidence subsequently confirmed the link between the rifle fire that had killed their father and the weaponry recovered from their residence. Ballistics matched, timelines aligned, and motive was established. Thus, the tragic arc was complete. A father slain by the very children he had supported, and those children themselves lost in a final act of violent defiance. The legal system would never have the opportunity to prosecute them, and the surviving family would never have the opportunity to confront them in court. What remained was the devastation of loss and the enduring questions such a case leaves behind. When we reflect upon this case, we must recognize several interconnected themes. First, there is the theme of family conflict, which, in this instance, metastasized into lethal violence, entitlement, resentment. It is not enough to dismiss such conflicts as private matters, for when threats of violence are voiced and patterns of hostility persist, the potential for tragedy is real. Second, we must acknowledge the challenges faced by law enforcement in navigating these volatile situations. Officers are required to balance compassion with suspicion, to support grieving survivors while simultaneously treating them as potential sources of evidence, and to confront armed suspects with courage yet restraint. The events of this case demonstrate both the professionalism of those who responded and the inherent dangers of their work. Confronted by gunfire, they withdrew and protected civilians rather than escalating indiscriminately, illustrating the disciplined training that underpins modern policing. Third, we must confront the question of motive, particularly the role of financial dependence and entitlement. Here were two young men, educated and capable, who nonetheless rejected responsibility for their own lives and instead demanded perpetual support. Their father's refusal to continue enabling their lifestyle was perceived as betrayal, and that perception became the seed of murderous intent. The psychological dynamics of such entitlement, how it is formed, how it festers, and how it leads to violence, are of critical importance for sociologists, psychologists, and policymakers alike. It forces us to ask how families can establish boundaries, how individuals can be guided toward independence, and how society can intervene when dependency becomes toxic. Fourth, we must recognize the community dimension of such crimes, mobilizing tactical units and instilling fear in bystanders. Violence is never truly private, for its consequences ripple outward to touch all who are nearby. It is in recognition of this reality that public policy must continue to focus not only on intervention after violence has occurred, but also on prevention before the threshold is crossed. It calls into question the meaning of loyalty, the obligations of kinship, and the role of gratitude. When those bonds are inverted into hostility, society itself shudders. Yet, in confronting such darkness, we also reaffirm our commitment to the values that bind us: respect, accountability, and the sanctity of human life. Of the importance of equipping law enforcement with the training and resources necessary to respond safely, and of the necessity of addressing underlying social issues that breed resentment and entitlement. It also demands empathy for the survivors, who must navigate grief compounded by betrayal, and for communities that must restore a sense of safety after violence intrudes upon their streets. This case, tragic though it is, cannot be dismissed as an anomaly. Family homicides, though statistically rare, occur with unsettling regularity, often fueled by disputes over money, inheritance, or perceived slights. Each instance underscores the reality that the family, while a source of support and love, can also become a crucible for resentment and violence. Our duty, as a society committed to justice and compassion, is to recognize those warning signs, to intervene where possible, and to ensure that when violence does occur, it is met with both accountability and resolve. And behind every violent act, a cascade of choices, motives, and failures that converged upon a single moment. By examining these moments with clarity and seriousness, we honor the memory of those lost and reaffirm our determination to build communities in which such tragedies are less likely to occur. It calls upon us to strengthen support systems, to foster independence and resilience in younger generations, to provide resources for conflict resolution, and to ensure that law enforcement remains prepared for the difficult, often dangerous work they must perform. Above all, it calls upon us to uphold the value of human life, to resist the corrosive forces of entitlement and resentment, and to reaffirm the bonds of responsibility that sustain our communities. It is only through such collective commitment that we may hope to prevent future tragedies of this kind. And it is only by speaking of them openly and seriously that we transform sorrow into resolve, despair into determination, and loss into a catalyst for deeper understanding.